They thought freedom was within their grasp. 8 fugitives. They had planned every detail: the stolen vehicle, the hidden safe houses, the new identities waiting just across the border. They were willing to do anything to disappear. That's why, when they came across a lone woman running the trails, they didn't hesitate. She was just another victim, just another pawn in their escape. Bruised and exhausted, she looked like an easy target. But appearances can be deceiving. They had no idea they had just taken a Delta Force commander with over 20 successful missions in the most grueling war zones in the world. What started as a simple kidnapping would unravel into a nationwide manhunt, turning hunter into hunted as she clawed her way back from the brink. The men who once felt invincible would watch their carefully laid plans crumble, their safe houses compromised, their allies dismantled one by one. This isn't just the story of a woman surviving against impossible odds. This is the story of how 8 ruthless criminals thought they had won, until they realized they had kidnapped the worst possible person. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. Naomi Cole pushed herself harder as she ran along the dirt trail, keeping a steady rhythm. She had been on the trail for over an hour, the crisp morning air filling her lungs as she maintained her pace. The national park stretched for miles in every direction, with nothing but dense forest around her. It was peaceful, isolated. That isolation had been part of the appeal. She had spent years in the military, always surrounded by people, never able to let her guard down. Running gave her the space she needed, a time to think, a time to forget. But something felt wrong. She caught a glimpse of movement to her right, a shadow slipping between the trees. She didn't react, keeping her breathing controlled, her pace steady. She wasn't armed, wasn't expecting trouble, but she had learned to trust her instincts. The forest had been alive with the sounds of birds and insects just minutes ago. Now it was silent. Ahead, off the trail, a black SUV was parked at an awkward angle near the tree line. The driver's door was open. She slowed, pretending to check her watch. The vehicle was covered in dust, the license plate barely visible. There was no one inside, but she could see movement near the trees, more than one person. Then she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, and a man was already lunging at her. Naomi shifted her weight and sidestepped, letting him stumble forward. He was tall, thick arms covered in tattoos, his face sunburned and unshaven. She barely had time to register him before 2 more men emerged from the trees, blocking the trail. Another stepped out from behind the SUV. There were 8 of them in total. She sized them up quickly. Prison uniforms, torn and dirty, mixed with stolen civilian clothes. Some carried makeshift weapons, pipes, a crowbar, a hunting knife. They looked like they had been on the run for days. But that didn't make them any less dangerous. A man with slicked-back hair stepped forward. He was leaner than the others, but there was confidence in the way he carried himself. He smirked. "No need to run. You're exactly what we needed." Naomi's muscles tensed. She didn't know who they were or what they wanted. But one thing was clear. They had been waiting for her. She wasn't going to let them take her without a fight. Naomi kept her stance neutral, her breathing steady, but her mind was already analyzing the situation. 8 men, all rough, all tense, all expecting her to react a certain way. They had her surrounded, cutting off the path ahead and blocking her retreat behind. It wasn't a sloppy formation, but it wasn't professional either. These weren't trained men. They were hardened by something else. Prison. The leader stepped forward, just enough to establish himself as the one in charge. He was lean, his slicked-back hair and worn leather jacket giving him the look of someone who thought he was untouchable. The way the others lingered behind him, waiting for his reaction, told her everything she needed to know. He was the one calling the shots. "You're a long way from help," he said smoothly. His voice was calm, almost friendly. But Naomi knew better than to be fooled by that kind of tone. "Ain't exactly a good place to be alone, wouldn't you say?" Naomi didn't flinch, didn't look away. She had spent too much time in too many dangerous places to be intimidated by a few men who thought their numbers made them powerful. "Seems to me you're the ones with the problem," she said evenly. A few of them chuckled at that, but it was the kind of laugh that didn't reach their eyes. The leader smirked, tilting his head slightly. "You don't know what's going on, do you?" He gestured lazily toward the SUV parked near the trees. "Take a guess." She didn't need to. She had already figured it out. "You broke out of prison," she said. The smirk widened. "That's right. 8 of us. Fresh out. And wouldn't you know it, the whole damn state is on high alert. Cops everywhere. Roadblocks. Patrols. Ain't exactly the kind of welcome wagon we were hoping for. And I'm supposed to care because—" The man's grin stretched wider. But there was a sharpness behind it now. "Because we need a way through. We need someone to help us pass the roadblocks, past the cops. And look at that. Right place. Right time." One of the other men, a stocky guy with a crooked nose and a fading black eye, crossed his arms. "I still think we should just take her stuff and move on." "You think we're just gonna walk through a roadblock looking like this?" The leader shot back, waving at their mismatched stolen clothing and prison tattoos. "We need a damn reason to be there." "She's it. She's a runner," another man muttered, eyeing Naomi. He had a sunburnt face and a thin, wiry build, the kind of guy who had been surviving on his nerves alone. "She ain't gonna get us past cops. She ain't just a runner," a deeper voice rumbled. Naomi turned her head slightly toward the one who had spoken. A massive man with a thick build and a shaved head. He was bigger than the others, broader, the kind of person who didn't need to carry a weapon, because his body was the weapon. He had been watching her closely, and Naomi knew exactly what he had seen. The way she had kept her feet positioned, the way she hadn't panicked, the way she had sized them up the moment they surrounded her. He had picked up on it. The leader turned to him. "Something you want to share, Brick?" The big man, Travis Brick Walker, didn't take his eyes off Naomi. "She's not scared." The others didn't seem to know what to make of that. Naomi stayed quiet, letting the moment settle, letting them wrestle with the fact that she wasn't reacting the way they expected. "Don't matter," the leader said after a moment, brushing it off. "She don't gotta be scared. She just has to cooperate." Naomi exhaled slowly. "And if I don't?" The leader sighed, running a hand through his slicked-back hair. "Lady, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Naomi didn't move. "That's not an answer." The leader was about to respond when one of the men, a younger guy with nervous energy radiating off him, took a step forward. "What if she tells the cops?" His voice had an edge of panic in it. "What if she gives us up?" The leader turned his head slightly, looking at him over his shoulder. "You planning to let her go?" The younger man hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm just saying, man. This is stupid. This ain't part of the plan. We were supposed to get out, lay low, find a way to move without heat. This is asking for heat. She's our way through," the leader repeated, his voice losing patience. "We take her. We use her to get past the roadblocks. Then we dump her. Simple. Dump her where?" The younger man's voice wavered slightly. The leader turned fully now, his posture shifting, his smirk gone. "You ask too many damn questions." The nervous guy swallowed hard, but didn't argue further. Naomi was watching closely, listening to every shift in tone, every crack in their unity. The younger one was afraid. He wasn't fully committed to this. That meant weakness. "Look," the leader said, turning back to Naomi. "This don't gotta be a fight. You walk with us nice and easy. Nobody gets hurt. We get through the roadblock, and you go on your way." Naomi didn't believe that for a second. She had been in situations like this before, had heard variations of that same line. It was never that simple. "Or," the leader continued, "you can make this real messy, real fast." Naomi kept her breathing steady. She could feel the tension settling around them, a charged moment where everything could shift in an instant. They were waiting for her to react, waiting for her to show fear or compliance. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, meeting the leader's gaze head-on. "I think we both know I'm not going anywhere with you." Silence stretched between them. The leader clicked his tongue, shaking his head like she had just disappointed him. Shame, he murmured. Then, without warning, one of the men lunged. The second the man lunged, Naomi moved. She twisted her body just as his arms reached for her, sidestepping smoothly as his momentum carried him past. His balance was off, and she took advantage of it instantly, slamming her elbow into the side of his jaw. His head snapped back violently, and before he could recover, she followed up with a quick, precise strike to his throat. He let out a choked gasp as his legs buckled beneath him, collapsing face first into the dirt. For half a second, there was silence. Then everything exploded at once. "Get her!" Naomi was already moving, her body twisting as another man grabbed at her from the side. She wrenched her arm free and drove her knee into his stomach, feeling his breath rush out as he doubled over. Before he could recover, she brought both hands down in a sharp hammer strike to the back of his neck, sending him sprawling forward. He hit the ground, groaning, but she didn't stop to see if he got up. She was already sprinting. She wasn't trying to escape. She knew they'd chase her no matter what, but they were bunched together, trying to grab her all at once. She needed space, needed to isolate them. The forest was dense, but the trail was narrow, lined with thick trees and uneven terrain. Naomi used it to her advantage, cutting sharp angles, darting between trunks, forcing them to react instead of plan. She could hear them shouting, crashing through the underbrush after her. "Cut her off! Move your ass! She's getting away!" A branch snapped to her right. Naomi turned just as a stocky man, Rust, the one with the busted lip, lunged from the side. She reacted instantly, planting her foot and dropping low, sweeping his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard with a strangled grunt, and Naomi was already moving again before he could recover. Footsteps pounded behind her, and she heard the unmistakable sound of breathing too close. She ducked as an arm swung toward her head, barely missing. She twisted, driving her elbow into the attacker's ribs. He grunted, staggering back, but another pair of hands reached for her from the other side. She spun away, moving fast, but they were adjusting now, trying to predict her movements. "She's too fast!" someone shouted. "Shut up and grab her!" Naomi saw the tree line ahead breaking into a small clearing, just enough space for them to spread out again. She had to make a choice: stay in the thick of the woods and keep moving, or turn and take another one down before they boxed her in. A shadow shifted in the trees ahead. Someone was trying to get in front of her. She didn't stop running, but she adjusted her course, angling slightly to the left. The second she broke through the clearing, she saw the man waiting for her. Thin, wiry, sunburnt, his stance tense but unsteady, slim. He had positioned himself to cut her off, but he wasn't ready for how fast she closed the distance. Naomi feinted left, forcing him to react, then snapped her foot into his knee. He yelped, stumbling, and she slammed her shoulder into his chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Shouts rang behind her, and she knew the others were catching up fast. She turned, ready to move again, but something slammed into her side. A solid mass, all brute strength and force. Brick. The impact took her off her feet. She hit the ground hard, the air rushing from her lungs as his weight bore down on her. His hands locked onto her wrists, pinning them into the dirt. "Enough of this," he growled, his grip tightening. Naomi struggled, twisting, trying to free herself, but he was too damn big, too heavy. His sheer size alone was enough to keep her locked down, no matter how well trained she was. "Don't kill her!" Vinny's voice cut through the chaos. "We need her alive!" Brick's grip didn't loosen, but he exhaled sharply, adjusting his hold. "She's got some fight," he muttered. "Almost respect it." Naomi wasn't listening. She was watching how his balance shifted slightly when he spoke, how he eased up just enough now that he thought she was done. She forced her body to go slack, just a little, just enough to make him think she was giving up. It took less than a second. Brick shifted his weight slightly, and Naomi reacted instantly. She snapped her hips up, twisting hard, throwing her full weight into the movement. His balance faltered, just enough for her to rip one arm free. She rammed her forearm into his throat, making him jerk back instinctively. His hold loosened, and she threw her knee into his ribs as hard as she could. Brick grunted, recoiling. But she wasn't free yet. Hands grabbed her from behind, yanking her upright before she could fully escape. She lashed out, twisting her body. But there were too many of them now. Too many hands pulling, grabbing, holding her down. She kicked out, catching one of them in the shin, but it wasn't enough. She had hurt them, had made them work for it. But now, they had her. Vinny stepped forward, brushing off his jacket, watching her with mild amusement as she stood there, breathing hard, muscles still coiled like she might lash out again. "You're making this real difficult, lady," he said, shaking his head. "Ain't no point in fighting now. You're coming with us. That's all there is to it." Naomi said nothing. She just kept breathing, kept watching, kept waiting. They had her for now, but they hadn't won yet. Naomi kept her breathing controlled, ignoring the burn in her muscles as she stared down the drop ahead. The rock face was steep, uneven, with jagged edges and loose dirt covering the slope. But it wasn't impossible. The landing at the bottom was rough, overgrown with thick brush and strewn with broken rock. But she could manage it. She had no choice. The sound of crashing footsteps behind her, the frantic voices of the men struggling to keep up, told her exactly how close they were. "She's got nowhere left to go," someone yelled, their voice breathless with exertion. She stepped back, her foot skimming the edge as she turned her head just enough to see them emerging from the trees. Vinny was in the lead, his jacket dirtied, his expression twisted with irritation. Right behind him were Brick, Rust, and Slim, all of them in varying states of exhaustion, their frustration boiling just beneath the surface. Slim's hands were still clenched around the pistol, his grip too tight, his stance nervous, while Rust was clearly favoring one side, limping slightly from where she had hit him earlier. Brick was the only one who looked completely unfazed, his steady breathing and sharp eyes making it clear he had more left in the tank than the others. Vinny came to a stop, shaking his head as he rolled his shoulders, letting the tension settle before exhaling. "You made this way harder than it needed to be. I'll give you credit for that, lady. You run like a damn deer." His voice was lighter than his expression, but the exhaustion behind it was obvious. They had all expected this to be simple, and Naomi had proven them wrong. She didn't speak, didn't react, just kept scanning their faces, watching how they shifted, how they positioned themselves. Slim was jumpy, still looking to Vinny for instruction. Rust was impatient, wanting this over with. Brick was waiting, letting them handle it, knowing if it came down to brute strength, he could step in. Vinny let out another sharp breath, adjusting his jacket as he nodded to himself. "Now, normally, this is where we'd offer you a deal. You stop fighting, you make this easy. Maybe we don't have to rough you up too much. But I think we're past that, don't you?" He took another step forward, lifting a hand toward the others without looking back. "Go on. Grab her!" The second they moved, Naomi pushed off the ground and launched herself over the edge. Shouts erupted behind her, but she was already in the air, tucking her body just as her feet hit the steep slope. The impact sent a sharp jolt through her legs, dirt and loose stone sliding beneath her. But she rolled into the motion, absorbing the force, keeping her momentum as she hit the ground hard. She felt her muscles protest, but she didn't stop. She pushed forward immediately, sprinting through the uneven terrain, forcing herself to move before they could find another way down. More shouting from above. She jumped! Go around! The terrain was rough, thick with trees and broken rock, but it gave her cover. She moved fast, weaving through the undergrowth, keeping low, listening for any sound that told her how quickly they were following. For a few seconds, it felt like she had finally bought herself some real distance. But the illusion didn't last long. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crashing through the brush sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through her. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see Brick moving through the trees at an alarming speed. He had taken the drop better than the others, his heavy frame unbothered by the rough landing, and he was gaining fast. He wasn't just running on anger or adrenaline like the others. He was methodical, efficient, tracking her like a predator that knew its prey was already exhausted. Naomi gritted her teeth, pushing harder even as her body screamed at her to stop. Ahead, a low branch stretched across her path, just high enough to use. She grabbed it without slowing down, using the momentum to swing herself forward, planting her feet on a thick tree trunk and kicking off just as Brick reached for her. He lunged, fingers brushing against the air where her arm had been. But she had already propelled herself forward, landing hard and rolling before taking off again. The forest ahead was denser, the ground uneven, the roots thick and tangled. If she could just keep going, if she could force them further away from their vehicle, further into terrain they weren't familiar with, she could shift this in her favor. A gunshot rang out. Naomi barely had time to react before bark exploded against the tree beside her, the sharp crack sending splinters flying in all directions. She didn't stop moving, throwing herself behind the nearest cover, her heart hammering as Slim's voice echoed through the trees. "You dumbass!" Vinny's voice was furious. "I said, we need her alive. I wasn't aiming at her," Slim yelled back, his voice panicked. "I was just trying to make her stop." "You keep shooting like that, you're gonna make her stop permanently." Naomi exhaled through her nose, steadying herself against the rough bark. They had a gun. That changed things. Before, she had been able to keep pushing forward, but now she had to be more careful. She wasn't trapped yet, but if they got a lucky shot or forced her into a bad position, everything would shift in their favor. She forced herself forward again, her body protesting every step. The ground beneath her was getting rockier, the trees thinning out, and that was when she saw it. A drop. The land cut off sharply just ahead, the dried-out river carving a sheer 20-foot cliff into the landscape. The bottom was jagged, filled with loose stone and thick brush, and there was no easy way down. She skidded to a stop, her breath heavy, her mind racing. She heard them closing in behind her, their footsteps thundering against the dirt. She was running out of options. "She stopped!" Rust's voice was closer now, his breathing ragged. "She's cornered!" Naomi turned slightly, her eyes flicking between the edge and the figures moving toward her through the trees. Vinny stepped through the undergrowth first, his smirk returning when he saw the cliff behind her. He stopped just a few feet away, glancing over the edge before shaking his head, amused. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" She clenched her fists, her muscles aching, her body screaming at her to move, but she was out of time. "All right, enough of this," Vinny muttered, waving a hand. "Brick, grab her!" She barely had time to react before Brick surged forward, his massive frame closing the distance in an instant. She twisted, trying to move, trying to throw him off, but her body was too drained, too slow. His arms locked around her, pulling her back as she fought against his grip, kicking, struggling, but he was too strong. "Finally," Rust muttered, bending over with his hands on his knees. "Can we tie her up now?" Vinny stepped forward, nodding. "Yeah, do it before she tries something else." Naomi's muscles tensed as Rust pulled a length of rope from his pocket, moving in to bind her wrists. She forced herself to breathe, forced herself to stay calm, searching for anything, any last opening she could use to break free. Nothing. She had run, had fought, had dragged them through every obstacle she could, but the exhaustion and the numbers had finally caught up to her. Vinny exhaled, brushing dirt off his jacket. "Hell of a chase. You almost made me work for it." He gave her a slow, knowing smirk. "Almost." Naomi said nothing as the rope tightened around her wrists, the rough fibers biting into her skin. She had lost this round. But she wasn't done yet. Naomi clenched her jaw as Rust yanked the rope tighter, the rough fibers digging into her wrists, securing her hands behind her back. Her breathing was steady despite the ache in her limbs, despite the exhaustion pulling at her muscles. She could feel the heat of their eyes on her, the weight of their stares filled with frustration, anger, and something darker beneath the surface. They had her now, but they weren't celebrating yet. "All right," Vinny muttered, rolling his shoulders before turning to the others. Let's get her the hell out of here. Brick tightened his grip around her arm, his strength unrelenting as he hauled her forward, dragging her across the uneven ground. Naomi's boots dug into the dirt for a moment, instinctively resisting, but the effort was wasted. She could barely keep herself upright, her body still recovering from the chase, and the last thing she needed was to burn the little energy she had left. She let them pull her along, keeping her breathing slow, forcing herself to take in every detail. The forest was still thick around them, but she could see the trail ahead breaking open, leading toward where they had left their stolen vehicle. They had been trying to get her back to it from the start. Now, they had what they wanted. Slim was still gripping the pistol, his fingers twitching around the handle as he threw wary glances in her direction. He hadn't gotten over his nerves, hadn't settled back into the same cocky ease the others had. His hands were clammy, his jaw tight. She could see it in his posture. He hadn't expected her to fight back like she had. Rust wiped the sweat from his brow, shooting Vinny a tired glare. What the hell's the plan now? That roadblock's still up, and we've wasted enough time screwing around in the woods. Vinny didn't answer right away. He walked ahead of them, leading the way back to the vehicle, his hands resting on his hips as he took a moment to think. He wasn't as calm as he was pretending to be. Naomi could see it in the way his fingers twitched slightly, in the way his shoulders stayed just a little too tense. This hadn't gone the way he planned. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, his tone clipped. "But we're not leaving her behind. She's still our best shot at getting through the roadblock." Rust let out a frustrated breath, shaking his head. "Yeah? And what if the cops don't buy whatever story you come up with? What if they start asking questions we can't answer?" Vinny stopped walking. He turned on his heel, his expression sharp as he looked Rust over. "Then we make them believe us," he said simply. "Or we find another way through. Either way, we're not ditching her. We've come too far for that." Naomi stayed quiet, letting the words sink in. They were keeping her alive because they still thought they could use her. That meant she had time. Not much, but enough. Brick gave her arm another sharp tug, pulling her forward, his grip a silent warning not to test him. She kept her feet moving, staying just ahead of Rust and Slim as they made their way back toward the clearing where the van sat waiting. The vehicle was parked just off the trail, partially hidden by thick brush. But now that she was closer, she could see the dents along the sides, the rust eating at the edges. It wasn't a reliable escape vehicle. She scanned the area, counting the available exits, looking for anything that could slow them down. No immediate openings, not yet. Brick shoved her toward the side door of the van, his patience wearing thin. "Get in." Naomi hesitated just enough to make him scowl before stepping up into the vehicle, ducking her head as she slid onto the floor near the back. She tested the rope around her wrists as subtly as she could, feeling the knot's tightness, searching for any give in the fibers. Nothing. The others climbed in after her, slamming the door shut behind them. Vinny took the passenger seat while Rust started the engine, the low rumble vibrating through the frame. The air inside was stifling, thick with sweat and frustration. Vinny turned in his seat, his sharp gaze settling on her. "You're real quiet now," he said. "That's good. Means you're finally catching on." Naomi met his stare, her expression unreadable. "I was just thinking," he smirked. "Yeah? About what?" She leaned her head back against the metal wall, keeping her voice even. "How this is gonna end." For a moment, there was silence. Then Rust snorted from the driver's seat, shaking his head as he threw the van into reverse. "You really think you're getting out of this, lady?" Naomi didn't answer. She didn't have to. The tension settling over the group told her that the thought had already crossed their minds. They had her for now, but they were already making mistakes. She just had to be ready when the next one came. The van rattled along the uneven dirt road, the engine growling as Rust forced it over every bump and dip in the terrain. The stifling heat inside made the air thick, the combined sweat and frustration clinging to every inch of the cramped interior. Naomi kept her posture relaxed, her head resting against the cold metal wall, her wrists still tightly bound behind her. Every shift in the vehicle's movement sent a dull throb through her body, her muscles aching from the fight, the chase, the struggle. But she wasn't focused on the pain. She was focused on them. Vinny sat in the front passenger seat, one arm resting on the window as he stared out, his expression unreadable. He was deep in thought, no doubt cycling through their dwindling options. Rust was gripping the steering wheel tight, his fingers drumming anxiously against the worn leather. Slim sat on the floor near the side door, still holding the gun, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. Brick was behind Naomi, taking up more space than anyone else, his arms crossed over his chest as he kept a close eye on her. The silence stretched, thick and tense, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Slim was the first to break. "So what's the damn plan, man?" His voice was high-strung, restless, his grip tightening on the pistol. "We got past the first roadblock, but they're going to be crawling all over the highways by now. We can't just drive through another one like it's nothing." Vinny let out a slow breath, dragging his fingers down his face before shaking his head. "We'll figure it out. We still got time before we hit the next one." "Time for what?" Rust snapped, his frustration bleeding through. "Time to get caught. We can't keep screwing around. This ain't some petty little escape. We're in deep. They're not just looking for us, they're hunting us." Naomi listened carefully, keeping her eyes half-lidded, her breathing even, as if she weren't paying attention. But she was. She caught the way Rust's voice edged toward panic, the way Slim's grip twitched around the gun every time he spoke. The fractures in their group were already forming, their desperation clawing at whatever loyalty they had left. Vinny turned in his seat, his gaze sharp. "You want to panic? You want to start whining about how bad it looks? Go ahead, Rust. But unless you got a better idea, shut the hell up and let me think." Rust let out a sharp breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter, but didn't argue. Brick finally spoke, his voice slow and measured. "We still got the girl." The van hit a pothole, jostling them roughly before Rust steadied the wheel again. Brick's words hung in the air, thick with implication, and Naomi felt the shift in the atmosphere. Vinny sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Yeah. We still got her, and we still use her to get through the next blockade. That hasn't changed." Slim scoffed. "How the hell is that supposed to work? Cops ain't just gonna let us drive through with a tied-up woman in the back. You think they won't ask questions?" Vinny's smirk returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "They won't see her tied up. We clean her up, make it look like she's with us. Maybe she's a hitchhiker. Maybe she's a girlfriend. Maybe she's in on it. Doesn't matter what story we go with, long as she plays along." Naomi finally opened her eyes fully, lifting her head just slightly. "And what if I don't?" The van went quiet again. Vinny turned to look at her, his smirk twisting into something colder. "Then we make you." Naomi held his gaze, unflinching, unfazed. "You think forcing me is going to help you get past a roadblock? You really think the cops won't notice when I look like I've been in a fight for my life?" Rust scoffed. "We can clean you up, fix your face, change your clothes. It ain't that hard." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, almost curious. "And if I talk?" Slim shifted uncomfortably, his knee still bouncing, his fingers flexing against the grip of the gun. Vinny's smirk twitched, just barely, the smallest flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Brick, however, didn't waver. "Then we kill you." The words landed heavy, the weight of them pressing into the already suffocating air. Slim's knee stopped bouncing. Rust exhaled sharply through his nose, his grip tightening on the wheel. Even Vinny hesitated for a fraction of a second before forcing his smirk back into place. Naomi didn't flinch. She just breathed, slow and even, letting them sit with the reality of what Brick had just said. "That's the problem, isn't it?" she murmured, voice low but unwavering. "You kill me, you lose your leverage, you keep me, and I'm a liability. No matter what you do, I'm dangerous to you." Vinny exhaled, shaking his head like he was brushing it off. "You love hearing yourself talk, don't you?" Naomi didn't respond. She just sat back against the wall, letting the van's movement lull her into stillness, watching the way they shifted, the way their plan wasn't as airtight as they wanted to believe. Slim muttered something under his breath, shifting uncomfortably. Rust rubbed a hand over his face, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Vinny stayed facing forward, his gaze locked on the road, pretending he wasn't rattled. Only Brick remained the same, silent, steady, unmoved. The fractures were growing. Naomi wasn't free yet, but she wasn't beaten either. She just had to wait for the next crack to split them open. The van rocked over uneven pavement as they hit the main road, the worn-out suspension making every bump feel worse than it was. Naomi stayed still, her back pressed against the metal wall, her arms pinned behind her, but her mind was working constantly. Every shift in their tone, every flicker of uncertainty, every moment of silence between them was another crack forming. They had the numbers. They had the gun. They had her hands bound behind her back. But they weren't in control. Not really. Rust was gripping the steering wheel too tightly, his knuckles pale, his shoulders tense. His earlier frustration had turned into something else. Exhaustion, maybe even doubt. Slim was still cradling the pistol, but his nervous energy wasn't fading. If anything, it was getting worse. He wasn't used to this, wasn't built for it. He was the kind of man who talked big, but folded under real pressure. Brick was unreadable, sitting with his arms crossed, his breathing steady, his presence heavy in the already cramped space. He wasn't worried about how the others were thinking. He was only focused on the task ahead. And then there was Vinny. Vinny still had his smirk, still acted like he had everything figured out. But Naomi could see the strain behind his eyes. He wasn't the leader because he was the smartest or the strongest. He was the leader because the rest of them needed someone to tell them what to do. But now that things weren't going according to plan, he was running out of ways to keep them in line. Naomi let her head tilt slightly against the metal wall, exhaling slowly, watching them. The tension in the van was thick, the hum of the road beneath them the only sound for a long time. "You're all quiet," she said finally, her voice calm, measured. "You didn't have a backup plan, did you?" Vinny didn't turn around, but she saw the way his jaw clenched. "Oh, we got plans. Just fine. Don't worry about that." "Do you?" Naomi asked, keeping her tone level. "Because from where I'm sitting it looks like you're making this up as you go." Slim let out a sharp exhale, his knee bouncing again. "Be quiet." Naomi didn't even look at him. She kept her eyes on Vinny, studying the way his fingers tapped against his thigh, like he was trying to think through the next step, while still keeping his grip on the conversation. "You got past one roadblock, but there'll be more," she continued, pushing just enough to make them shift, just enough to keep them unsteady. "Cops are already tracking you. Maybe not your van yet, but your faces are everywhere by now. You can't walk into a gas station without someone recognizing you." Rust let out a scoff from the driver's seat, but it wasn't confident. "We've handled worse." "You've handled worse in prison," Naomi corrected, "where you knew the rules, where you had a system, people watching your back. You don't have that out here. No walls, no guards, no codes to fall back on. You're not running a gang in a controlled space anymore. You're just running." Silence. She could feel the shift happening, the way Slim's fingers twitched against the gun, the way Rust exhaled through his nose like he was trying to block out what she was saying. She knew what doubt sounded like. Vinny chuckled, low and forced. "You love the sound of your own voice, don't you?" Naomi ignored him. "You're already turning on each other." Slim shifted, his grip tightening. "That's not true." "Really?" Naomi asked, finally looking at him. "Because, from where I'm sitting, you're the one holding the gun. But you're not leading. You're not even deciding what happens next. You're just waiting to be told what to do, hoping no one notices that you're not making any choices yourself." Slim's jaw tightened, but Naomi saw the flicker of something in his expression. "He's doing fine," Rust muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Naomi turned her attention back to Vinny, watching as he exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to keep the grin on his face. "That's a nice trick," he said, shaking his head. "Trying to stir trouble. Ain't gonna work." Naomi let her lips quirk into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You sure?" The van jolted suddenly as Rust swerved to avoid a pothole, sending a hard jerk through the cabin. Naomi let her body shift with the movement, using it to test the ropes again, to see if they had loosened at all in the last hour. Still tight, still holding. But that didn't mean they were unbreakable. She kept her breathing slow, watching, waiting. "I don't care what she says," Brick muttered from behind her. His voice was calm, level, completely unbothered by everything happening around him. "We stick to the plan, get through the next roadblock. Then we figure out where we're heading after that." Vinny nodded like he agreed, but Naomi caught the flicker of something else in his expression. Brick wasn't following him. Brick was making his own calls now. Rust ran a hand down his face, shaking his head. "Yeah. And what's after that, genius? You think we just disappear? You think we get across the border and live happily ever after?" Vinny exhaled sharply. "We keep moving. That's what we do." Rust let out a dry, humorless laugh. "That's not a plan. That's just stalling. You don't know what's next, do you?" Naomi stayed silent, watching the way Rust's hands tensed on the wheel, the way Slim kept glancing between the gun and Vinny. Like he wasn't sure who to listen to anymore. She had planted the seed, and now she just had to wait. The fractures were growing. They wouldn't break yet, but soon. The van's engine droned low, a steady vibration through the floor as they rolled onto the highway. The forest was behind them now, replaced by long stretches of road cutting through open fields and scattered towns. Naomi kept her breathing steady, her wrists still bound behind her back, her shoulders tight from holding the same position for too long. Vinny hadn't spoken much since the last conversation. His smirk had faded, his mind working too hard to come up with a plan that made sense. They were closing in on the next roadblock, and they all knew it. The tension in the van had thickened, pressing down like a weight none of them could shake. Rust's grip on the wheel was stiff, his fingers wrapped too tight, his shoulders hunched like he was preparing for something to go wrong. Slim was fidgeting with the gun again, his knee bouncing, eyes darting to Naomi every few minutes like he expected her to do something. Brick, as always, sat silent, his presence more of a warning than anything else. Vinny finally exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he muttered. "We do it just like I said. We clean her up, make her look normal. No ropes, no marks, no struggle." He turned in his seat, locking eyes with Naomi. "You're gonna be in the passenger seat. You don't talk unless I say. You smile, you look calm, and you don't do anything stupid." Naomi met his gaze evenly. "And if I do?" Vinny's smirk returned, but it was smaller, more forced. "Then we'll have to make sure you don't get the chance to say anything at all." Rust scoffed under his breath, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. We're putting everything on the line for this? You really think it's gonna work?" Vinny shot him a glare. "Unless you got a better idea. Shut up and drive." Rust muttered something under his breath, but didn't argue. Naomi kept her expression unreadable, but inside, she was already adjusting her plan. This was risky, but she could work with it. They wanted her in the front seat, visible but controlled. That gave her an opening. Vinny turned back to Brick. "Untie her, but do it slow." Brick reached for the ropes, his large hands working methodically, not giving her an inch of unnecessary movement. As soon as her wrists were free, Naomi rolled her shoulders, easing the tension. But she didn't react beyond that. She kept still, knowing any sudden movement would set them on edge. Slim gripped the gun a little tighter. "I don't like this." Vinny exhaled through his nose, clearly losing patience. "You don't like anything, Slim. Just keep your head straight and let me handle it." Brick nudged Naomi forward. "Move." She slid into the passenger seat, the stiffness in her muscles making it clear just how much time she had spent bound in the back. Vinny reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a rag. "Clean your face." Naomi took the cloth, dabbing at the dirt and sweat that had streaked across her skin from the struggle. The bruises forming along her jaw were unavoidable, but they weren't obvious enough to raise immediate suspicion. She kept her movements slow, deliberate, not making eye contact as she wiped her hands against the fabric of her pants, shaking off the last of the tension in her limbs. Slim was still muttering under his breath. "This is bad. We should have gone another way." Vinny turned in his seat, his expression tightening. "And run where? You think back roads are going to save us? We go through this roadblock, clean and easy, or we spend the next few hours trying to dodge patrols until we run out of options. So, stop talking and get ready." Rust's grip on the wheel twitched slightly, his face tight with stress, but he didn't argue. The road ahead stretched long and open, but in the distance, Naomi could already see the flashing lights, the roadblock. Vinny straightened his jacket, rolling his shoulders like he was getting into character. He glanced at Naomi, his smirk returning just enough to try and sell the illusion. "Play nice, sweetheart. We're almost home free." Naomi didn't react. She just watched the road ahead, waiting. The line of cars leading up to the blockade moved slowly, uniformed officers standing at intervals, scanning each vehicle that passed through. Some were speaking with drivers, others watching closely, looking for signs of trouble. Rust swallowed hard. "Here we go." Vinny leaned slightly toward Naomi, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. "Remember, one wrong move, and you won't like what happens next." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The van rolled forward, inching closer. Naomi kept her posture relaxed, her expression neutral. Just another passenger in just another vehicle. The officer ahead waved them forward, stepping closer to the driver's side window. Rust forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Afternoon, officer." The man gave a short nod, scanning the inside of the van. "Where you folks heading? Family trip?" Vinny answered smoothly before Rust could stumble over his words. "Had to take a little detour after hitting some bad traffic earlier. You know how it is." The officer barely looked at him. His eyes had already landed on Naomi. She felt it instantly. The pause, the calculation, the slight narrowing of his gaze. She forced herself to breathe evenly, tilting her head slightly, making it seem like she was simply waiting, unconcerned. "You all right, miss?" the officer asked, his voice polite but edged with something sharper. Naomi smiled, small and effortless, tilting her shoulders just slightly toward Vinny like it was natural. "Yeah, just tired. Been on the road a while." The officer's eyes flickered toward Vinny, who gave an easy shrug. "You know how long drives get." She's not much for conversation after the first few hours. Naomi could feel Slim's tension in the back seat, could hear the barely restrained breath Rust was holding. She didn't dare look at Brick, knowing full well that his stillness was unreadable, even to her. The officer lingered a second longer, scanning the inside of the van, his gaze catching on Slim's nervous fidgeting. Naomi's heart beat steady, even as she felt Slim's fingers tightening around the pistol out of sight. If he so much as twitched wrong, this entire plan would fall apart. Another officer stepped toward the window, his voice cutting through the moment. "This the last one?" The first officer gave them one final look before nodding. "Yeah, go on through." Rust let out an audible breath as he shifted the van into drive, rolling forward at a controlled pace. Not too fast, not too slow. The second they were past the checkpoint, the atmosphere inside the van changed instantly. Vinny exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. "Told you it would work." Rust didn't answer, just focused on the road, his fingers still gripping the wheel like he was expecting something to go wrong. Slim let out a nervous laugh, shaking his head. "That was way too close." Brick, as always, said nothing. Naomi sat still, her breathing even, her mind already working on what came next. They had gotten through, but they weren't safe, not yet. The van had been moving for over an hour since they passed the roadblock, and the tension inside hadn't settled. If anything, it had worsened. Naomi sat still in the passenger seat, feeling the subtle shifts in the group's dynamic. The moment they had passed through the checkpoint, Vinny had relaxed, but the others hadn't. Slim was still on edge, Rust hadn't loosened his grip on the wheel, and Brick remained unreadable as ever. But now, she could feel another presence behind her. A heavy thud sounded as someone shifted in the farthest corner of the van. Then another. She had known since the beginning there were more of them. 8 total. But she hadn't seen them all. Some had stayed hidden in the shadows, keeping quiet. Now, as the van turned down an isolated, cracked road surrounded by nothing but overgrown grass and scattered trees, the rest of them began shifting into view. Grady leaned forward first, wiry and hollow-cheeked, his fingers tapping against his knee. He gave Naomi a slow, thin smile, like he had already decided how this was going to end. Figured you'd meet the rest of us eventually. Beside him, Carl let out a slow breath, arms crossed over his broad chest, his expression unreadable. Doyle, the one with the scar down his face, barely looked at her. His knuckles were cracked, his hands resting on his lap like he was waiting for an excuse to use them. Rust glanced toward the rearview mirror, then back at Vinny. "We need to deal with her now." Slim shifted uncomfortably, his grip still tight on the gun in his lap. "We should have left her in the woods back there. Now we're stuck with her." Naomi didn't move, didn't react, just listened. Vinny exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "Relax. We're almost done here." Rust let out a frustrated breath. "You think she's just gonna sit quiet after we let her go? She knows too much." Naomi caught the slight shift in the van, the way Slim stiffened, the way Carl and Doyle exchanged a brief glance. Grady chuckled under his breath. "She's got a point, though. You really gonna let her walk away?" Slim swallowed hard, his knee bouncing again. "We don't have to." Rust shot him a glare. "You gonna be soft now?" Vinny let out a slow breath, his fingers drumming against his thigh as he thought it over. "I'm not worried about her talking. By the time she gets anywhere, we'll be long gone. Unless someone finds her first," Carl muttered. Rust turned in his seat, his frustration boiling over. "No one's gonna find her if we handle it now." The van went silent. Slim clenched his jaw. "You mean?" Rust didn't say it outright, but he didn't need to. The weight of his words settled over the group like a heavy stone. Vinny sighed, shaking his head. "No, too messy. We don't need the extra heat." Rust scoffed. "You really want to take that chance?" Grady smirked, leaning forward slightly. "I say we do it clean. Quick. She's already halfway there anyway." Naomi stayed completely still. Vinny exhaled again, slower this time. "We're not killing her." His voice was final. "We don't need the trouble. We leave her here, middle of nowhere. She won't make it far." Rust didn't argue, but his jaw tightened. He wanted her dead. Slim let out a slow breath, like he had been holding it in. "That's it? We're just leaving her?" Vinny gave him a pointed look. "Unless you want to be the one to pull the trigger." Slim hesitated. Naomi saw it in his face. He wasn't built for that kind of decision. Grady let out a disappointed sigh, shaking his head. "Fine, but don't come crying later if she shows up again." Vinny didn't acknowledge it. He just motioned to Brick. "Get her out." Brick didn't hesitate. His grip clamped onto Naomi's arm, dragging her toward the back doors. She didn't fight. Not yet. The moment the doors opened, cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and old trees. The terrain was uneven, the dirt broken up by exposed roots and thick patches of brush. This wasn't just some random drop-off. They had planned for this. Brick shoved her forward, and she stumbled onto the rough ground, catching herself before she could hit her knees. Before she could move, Doyle stepped forward, looping a length of rope around her wrists again, pulling them behind her back with practiced ease. Naomi clenched her teeth, watching the others. "You should have stayed quiet," Vinny mused, stepping out of the van. "You're smart. I'll give you that. But smart don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Grady leaned against the van, watching her like she was a puzzle he had already solved. "Shame. Really, you put up a good fight." Slim swallowed hard, his face pale. He didn't step forward, didn't look at her directly. He wasn't like the others. He wanted her gone, but he didn't have the stomach for it. Vinny sighed, rubbing a hand over his face like this was some minor inconvenience. "All right, let's get this done." Rust nodded, stepping closer with a length of duct tape. Naomi tensed, every muscle in her body coiled, waiting for the right second. She wasn't going to let them leave her out here, but they weren't going to make it easy. Doyle's grip tightened on her arms, and Rust yanked the tape forward, just as Naomi moved. She threw her weight backward, slamming Doyle into the side of the van, knocking him off balance just enough to loosen his hold. The moment she felt the slack, she twisted, driving her knee up into his ribs, forcing a sharp grunt from his chest. Vinny reacted instantly. His fist snapped out, catching her just under the ribs, knocking the air from her lungs. The impact sent her stumbling back, but she stayed on her feet, forcing herself upright. Brick was already moving. Before she could launch another strike, his hands clamped onto her shoulders, spinning her around and shoving her down into the dirt. Her arms wrenched behind her, pain flaring through her shoulders as Doyle regained his footing, grabbing hold of the rope. "Enough!" Brick muttered, his voice as steady as ever. Naomi breathed hard through her nose, keeping her expression blank as the ropes bit into her wrists once more, this time tighter, more unforgiving. Vinny let out a long exhale, shaking his head. That was a waste of time. Rust tore a strip of tape and pressed it over Naomi's mouth, his fingers digging into her jaw as he made sure it was secure. "Not so tough now, are you?" She didn't react, didn't give them the satisfaction of a struggle. Vinny turned to the others, already done with this moment. "Let's go." They moved quickly, not even sparing her a last glance as they climbed back into the van. The doors slammed shut, the engine revved, and the tires kicked up dirt and gravel as the vehicle peeled away. The sound of the van faded into the night, leaving Naomi alone in the cold, bound, bruised, and bleeding. But she wasn't dead, and they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The night was silent. The only sound was the distant hum of the van's engine fading into the darkness. Naomi lay still for a moment, her body aching, her breath steadying as the weight of what had just happened sank in. They had left her bound, gagged, and alone in the middle of nowhere. They thought they had won. They thought she was as good as dead. She rolled onto her side, testing the ropes around her wrists. They had been tightened after her last attempt to fight back, the fibers digging into her skin. The duct tape over her mouth made breathing slightly harder, but not impossible. She focused, pushing aside the pain, the exhaustion, and the frustration. Right now, none of that mattered. Right now, all that mattered was getting free. The ground beneath her was rough, uneven dirt, mixed with patches of grass and scattered leaves. The darkness stretched in every direction, trees swaying gently in the wind, their rustling the only reminder that the world around her was still alive. There was no road, no signs of civilization, no immediate way to call for help. She didn't panic. She shifted slightly, rolling onto her knees, her arms still trapped behind her. The ropes were tight, but they weren't perfect. Doyle had been quick when he tied them, but quick didn't mean flawless. Naomi twisted her wrists, feeling out the tension points, the slight give in the knot. It wasn't much, but it was something. She took a slow breath, pressing the edge of the rope against a jagged rock embedded in the dirt. The fibers didn't snap immediately. It would take time, patience. Every movement had to be controlled, every shift deliberate. She didn't have the luxury of rushing. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the distant sound of something moving in the trees. An animal, maybe. Or worse, one of them coming back to check if she was still breathing. She moved faster. The fibers began to fray. Sweat trickled down her temple, her muscles burning from holding the same position for too long. She twisted again, the rope catching against the rock at just the right angle. Snap! The relief was instant. The pressure around her wrists loosened, and she yanked her arms free, wincing as blood rushed back into her hands. She reached up immediately, peeling the duct tape from her mouth, her skin stinging as it came away. She exhaled, finally able to take a deep, steady breath. She wasn't free yet. Naomi pushed herself to her feet, rolling her shoulders, flexing her fingers to work out the stiffness. Her body was covered in scrapes and bruises, her ribs aching from the blows she had taken earlier. But none of that mattered now. She turned, scanning her surroundings, taking in the landscape. The area was thick with trees, dense enough that she had some cover, but open enough that she could move. The van tracks were still fresh in the dirt, leading back toward the main road. She could follow them, but she knew better. They weren't going to stop running. She had spent her life hunting men like them. Now, they were her mission. Naomi inhaled deeply, her mind already working through the next steps. She needed to find help, to get word out before they could disappear again. The manhunt would already be in motion. The second those roadblocks went up, the authorities would have started tracking their movements. But that wasn't enough. She had seen them up close. She knew what they were capable of. Rust had been the most vocal about getting rid of her, but he wasn't the only one who wanted it. Grady had suggested it without hesitation, and Vinny, despite playing it cool, hadn't argued much. That told her everything she needed to know. They weren't running just to be free. They were running so they could go back to the only thing they knew. Naomi had spent years tracking criminals, understanding their patterns, their mistakes. These men weren't just escaping. They had a plan. They had contacts somewhere, a place to regroup, people who would help them disappear. If she didn't stop them now, they would vanish. And when they reappeared, it wouldn't be as fugitives. It would be as monsters ready to do what they had done before. That wasn't going to happen. She took another breath, calming the storm inside her. This wasn't fear. This was clarity. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to hunt them down, every last one of them. Naomi moved with a calculated urgency, her body aching but her mind sharper than ever. The night air was cool against her skin, the adrenaline still dulling the worst of the bruises that would come later. The thick forest had been suffocating. But now, as she reached the clearing, she could see the faint glow of headlights in the distance, a beacon against the darkness, a road, civilization, a way to turn this around. She wasn't out of danger yet. She couldn't afford to make a mistake now. The prisoners thought she was dead. But if any of them had second thoughts, if they circled back just to be sure, she had no doubt they would finish what they started. She had to move fast. Pushing forward, she stayed just inside the tree line, keeping to the shadows as she scanned the empty road stretching ahead. It was a quiet, two-lane highway, the kind that barely saw traffic at this hour. She didn't have the luxury of waiting for something better. If she wanted to stop them, she needed to get in contact with someone now. The low hum of an engine cut through the silence, headlights cresting over the distant hill. She stepped forward immediately, moving toward the edge of the road, lifting her arms and waving them down. The vehicle slowed, tires crunching against the gravel shoulder, the driver clearly hesitant as he took in the sight of her. Bruised, battered, and standing alone on a dark road miles away from anywhere. The window rolled down cautiously, revealing a middle-aged man, his expression wary but concerned. "Miss, are you all right?" Naomi didn't waste time. "I need your phone," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "Please, it's an emergency." The man hesitated for only a second before fumbling into his pocket, pulling out his phone and handing it over. She took it quickly, her fingers moving across the screen as she dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang once, then again, then a voice cut through the static, sharp and urgent. "This is Special Agent Carter." Naomi exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. "Carter, it's Commander Naomi Cole." Silence. Then, the shift in his tone. "Commander Cole? Where the hell are you? We've got every agency in the country looking for those fugitives." "I know," she said, her breath steadying. "And I know where they're going." A pause. Then, "Are you hurt?" "Nothing I can't handle," she replied. There was no time for details. "Listen to me. I was taken by them. I know their setup. I know how they move. And I know they're not just running." Carter's voice hardened. "Explain." "They had a plan before they even broke out," Naomi said. "This isn't about disappearing. They've got contacts, resources. They're not looking to escape. They're looking to regroup." A beat of silence. Then, Carter swore under his breath. "Where are you?" Naomi turned, scanning her surroundings, then spotted a rusted, weather-beaten road sign near the shoulder. "County Road 16, just south of—" "We're sending a team. Stay put." She clenched her jaw. "No. Commander, you need me in this," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "They think I'm dead. That gives us an advantage. I can track them before they disappear for good." Carter exhaled sharply, the hesitation clear. "You're not going to wait for backup, are you?" "You already know the answer to that," Naomi said evenly. Another long pause, then a sigh. "Fine, but you don't go in alone. We coordinate this. I'll check in when I have something," she said. "Naomi," She ended the call before he could argue further, lowering the phone as she turned back to the driver, who was still watching her with a mixture of concern and confusion. Do you need a ride somewhere? Or should I stay here? He asked carefully. Naomi shook her head. No, you should go. But when you get to town, tell the first police officer you see that Naomi Cole is alive, and she's after them. The man blinked, clearly not understanding the full weight of what she was saying. But he nodded quickly, his hands gripping the wheel a little tighter. Okay, I can do that. She handed the phone back, offering a tight nod of thanks before stepping back from the car. The driver hesitated for a moment longer before finally pulling away, his taillights disappearing into the night. Naomi exhaled, rolling her shoulders, feeling the dull ache settle into her bones. She was alone again. But that didn't matter. The fugitives thought they had left her for dead. Now, she was going to make sure none of them got away. Naomi stood at the edge of the road, watching the taillights of the car disappear into the darkness. The world felt quiet for a moment, the wind rustling through the trees, the hum of distant insects, the only sound cutting through the silence. Her body ached from the beating she had taken, her ribs sore, her muscles stiff from the struggle and the long trek through the woods. But none of that mattered now. She inhaled deeply, focusing her mind. The prisoners were out there, and they thought they had won. That arrogance was their first mistake. She turned back toward the woods, scanning the terrain, replaying everything she had learned while she had been in their custody. They had a plan. Something bigger than just running. The way Vinny had handled things, the way Rust and Grady had spoken so casually about getting rid of her, it told her they weren't just desperate men looking for freedom. They were dangerous because they had nothing to lose, but more importantly, they had something to gain. That meant they had a destination. They wouldn't stay on main roads for long. Law enforcement would already be scanning the highways, checking every intersection, every gas station, every stolen vehicle. These men weren't the type to take unnecessary risks. They had a route in mind, a fallback plan, and Naomi had to figure it out before they disappeared for good. She crouched near the side of the road, running her fingers over the dirt where the van's tires had kicked up gravel. They had turned off the main highway back there, heading deeper into the back roads. She knew the general layout of the area. There weren't many places they could go without hitting a town or another checkpoint. If they were smart, they would be heading toward a place where they could get off the grid entirely. There was an old truck stop about 30 miles north, the kind that catered to long-haul drivers, cash transactions, and people who didn't ask questions. If they needed a new vehicle, that would be the place to go. If they were looking to meet someone, it would be a good rendezvous point. She started moving, staying close to the edge of the road, but off the asphalt, keeping to the shadows. She didn't need to travel far, just enough to catch a break, find a ride, and get ahead of them before they had a chance to vanish. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour, her body pushing through the exhaustion until she spotted the faint glow of distant headlights cresting over the horizon. Another vehicle, a truck this time, its rumbling engine breaking the stillness of the night. Naomi stepped forward, waving it down. The truck slowed, the brakes hissing as it rolled to a stop beside her. The driver leaned out, a man in his 60s, his face lined with years of long hauls and hard work. His gaze flicked over her,